Loading. Welcome to Access the Animus.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new video here on Access the Animus. As promised, today we're going to bring you our full story analysis of the Odyssey portion of the recent Assassin's Creed crossover event, so spoiler alert if you haven't played it already. In the video, we're going to have a look at Kassandra's final story in Odyssey, at least for now, Aletheia's new task involving destroying all the pieces of Eden, the interaction between the apple and the spear, and in general a lot of story references and explanations to Odyssey's main game ending. We're also going to address the ending of the quest and especially the post-credits scene featuring Kassandra's voyage to Egypt and that hidden blade bracer that she's wearing in Valhalla, with a number of theories and speculation about a potential crossover with Assassin's Creed Origins taking place in Egypt. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it, subscribing to our channel and turning the notifications on so you won't miss any of our future updates. And with that out of the way, let's dive into the new Odyssey quest featuring Kassandra and her destiny. As we mentioned in our Odyssey recap video, the story picks up after all the events from Odyssey's main game and its DLCs, and especially what was shown in the Hero Memories quest and the Fate of Atlantis DLC, with Kassandra accepting her role as immortal keeper of the staff, who had to keep control of the artifact until she could deliver it to Layla's son. The quest immediately starts with Kassandra stating that this role is starting to weigh on her, that her life as Misthios and then Keeper is taking a toll on her, and she does indeed need a break, and that's where she moves to the island of Corfu for a vacation. What she thought to be a couple of days actually turned into 6 months until she was reached by Barnabas and Herodotus, who had been looking for her across the entire island. Knowing that Kassandra had halted her activity, they did wonder if she was retiring, but even with a sad look, she said that she did not and that she could not. And this actually opens up to a nice moment where Kassandra openly told Herodotus and Barnabas how she was feeling the weight of her life and her burdens and how she wanted a break from that, and that's why the two of them tried to set her on a treasure hunt that actually they had prepared for her to bring her a distraction for what she was feeling, while also bringing back memories of all the other treasure hunts and missions that they had embarked on together in the past. So Kassandra accepted and went to a sort of hideout where she had hidden all her belongings from her adventure along with her equipment. And let's not dwell too much on how she was able to bring a huge stone eagle through a crack she was barely able to fit through, and this area is one of various nostalgia-oriented elements of the quest, which has some visual references to her adventures in Sparta and Athens, but also has items that remind Kassandra of Phidias, the sculptor, Brasidas, the Spartan general who died at the hands of Deimos, and Alcibiades, the licentious Athenian that also followed her in many adventures and actually wrote to Cass a letter while she was in Corfu. Eventually, Kassandra got her items back, and in doing so, players don't only get the getaway outfit in-game, but also the famous sun hat that was at the center of a lot of discussion during the post-launch period of Odyssey, with the 99% sunburn resistant perk that so many people wondered about back then. After that, Cass finally started her fake treasure hunt that took her through the island of Corfu, and I have to say, I am still surprised today that a team of developers really went back to a 3 years old game to work on an entirely new map with new and old characters, new dialogues, a new story, having the voice actors come back, doing the motion capture I would imagine. I'm impressed really, and I believe that this is such a unique feat that's been pulled off here, so kudos to all the people that work on this, and as a little spoiler, this is also my favorite between the two crossover quests, and I'm still surprised to this day that I enjoyed so much some Odyssey content after I disliked most of the content from the main game and its DLCs. I really don't know what to say, I'm really impressed. Anyway, Kassandra did start her adventure, but right off the bat she realized that Barnabas and Herodotus were behind the treasure hunt that they set her on, and that all the various tablets that can be found scattered around the island of Corfu did tell the story of Kassandra herself and her friends. So Kassandra did appreciate Barnabas and Herodotus' attempt at bringing more spice in her life and decided to play along, and reached the next step, which involved a water jar and a goat, a clear reference to when Kassandra found Barnabas in Kefalonia, and, well, the eye in the goat's bum thing, which we actually already discussed in our Odyssey recap video. Kassandra thought that Barnabas had hired some pirates to be part of the fake treasure hunt, but after being captured by them, she very soon realized that those were real pirates who were actually looking for a very real treasure based on the so-called letter of a treasure hunter that was apparently undecipherable. So this led Kassandra to this real treasure hunt which, and this was probably the element that I liked the least about this part of the crossover, quest-wise turned into a series of go from point A to point B, collect item or info, then go from point B to point C, collect item or info, then off to point C, and so on, which sadly was at the core of too many quests within Odyssey's main game too. On the bright side though, this also leads to obtain a very particular weapon, a dagger called Knife of Dalwun, which seems to somewhat solve a good chunk of the one-shot assassination issues that Odyssey has, allowing players to always assassinate enemies at the level of the weapons or below, but at the cost of having health capped at 25%, which to me is a bearable cost if I can try and stealth my way out of a fort without worrying that my stats aren't deemed worthy enough to make me feel like an assassin, but I digress. So this going from point A to point B and so on led Cass to find the letter by the treasure hunter, bring it back to Herodotus and Barnabas while explaining the mishap about the fake and real treasure hunts, get to know that the letter is about an ancient story that involves a sunken key within a temple, find the key, try and find the professor who can fully translate the letter along with Herodotus, look for them in the professor's house, look for them in a pirate warehouse, look for them in a quarry, and finally find the professor's dead body. Here, Cass found a letter by a generic enemy called the Captain, who said that he had kidnapped Herodotus and had found the so-called treasure, but couldn't open it without the key that Kassandra had with her, so he forced her to reach him and give him the key in exchange for her historian friend. So of course Cass was tricked into giving this generic captain the key, then she saved Herodotus and finally caught up with the captain who had found in the chest once held by the quote-unquote most famous of all treasure hunters, no less than an apple of Eden, which had already started to corrupt him. Interestingly enough, Kassandra recognized it as an artifact that would supposedly make him go mad, which is a justified reaction, as this is a reference to what she saw with the Atlantis artifacts, which indeed corrupted and then transformed normal humans into monsters, and this fear by Kassandra would later be confirmed by Herodotus, who actually stated that the letter mentioned the artifact itself and that it was so powerful it could turn men into their darkest fears. So Kassandra fought the captain and eventually killed him, but when she got close to the apple, her spear started to interact with it. It glowed as the apple started spinning around, releasing more energy before the interaction between the two pieces of Eden was too powerful, which caused the apple to fly in the distance like a Dragon Ball, and more importantly the spear to lose all its powers and Kassandra to lose all her abilities. This is a pretty poignant moment both in terms of story and in terms of gameplay, of course. Story-wise, this is where the spear lost all of its powers, which is also an explanation and reference to what Kassandra told Layla about her spear at the end of Odyssey's main game, where she said that she could keep the spear because it had long lost all its powers. Gameplay-wise though, this shifts the gameplay completely, as from now on the island of Corfu you can't use the spear's abilities anymore, and you're relegated to your human skills and the perks of your weapons. So yeah, that one-shot assassination dagger didn't sound too bad when I played this for the first time. Thus, Kassandra went on to try and find Barnabas and Herodotus and told them about the apple and how such artifacts actually could turn people into monsters, both physically and metaphorically, and can even break other artifacts like her spear, which actually prompted Barnabas' interest in this specific apple. Kassandra at some point was also stopped from her adventure by the voice of Aletheia, the Isu whose conscience had been stored within the staff of Hermes Trismegistus, who told her to go specifically to the tomb of Phaeax nearby because she wanted to show her something that no one else had to see or hear about. Aletheia explained that the sphere of Leonidas had lost its powers because it was overwhelmed by the energies it held, and indeed it was the interaction with the apple that caused it, quote-unquote pushing the sphere to its limits and thus becoming useless. What Aletheia wanted to talk to Kassandra about, though, was her destiny. In a classic AC moment, she showed her a hologram of the Earth, with a number of locations pinpointed on it, representing where other pieces of Eden were located, while some lines that seemed to show the planet's orbit and some more visual designs and text appeared all around it, which are pretty much similar to the ones shown in Atlantis already in Odyssey's main game, and thus should not bear any proper meaning. Aletheia told Cass that that was a representation of the planet Earth, which technically she had already seen in front of the gateway to the Lost City area in Atlantis, and that all the locations shown in there were actually the places where the world's Isu artifacts were positioned, and more specifically that these artifacts were actually lying hidden, so probably within some Isu temples and not out in the open. Now, of course, if you have been following the franchise for some time, you may know that there have been other maps that showed the locations of several pieces of Eden across the world, that were shared in different time periods and settings, like ancient Egypt and the Crusades, so this actually seems to be showing the locations of the artifacts stored within temples around the late 420s or early 410s BCE, which is when this scene is taking place. And yes, at some point we're going to have a proper analysis aimed at the various locations shown in here, but for now suffice to say that Aletheia says that the artifacts are stored in there, not without reason, but she doesn't provide any motivation to, leaving this intentionally confusing, even though from Assassin's Creed 2 we do know that the various temples had been built by those who knew to turn away from the Isu-human war, and whose work was aimed at protecting from the catastrophe, which actually didn't really work, and from Assassin's Creed Brotherhood we also know that in the face of the impending catastrophe, some Isu tried to destroy their artifacts so that they couldn't fall into human hands, or to seal away what they couldn't destroy, so that's another reason why the artifacts are indeed in the temples, if we can trust Juno and what she told Desmond. Anyway, Aletheia was vague, probably intentionally vague with Kassandra, but she was very precise in tasking her, the keeper of the staff, with destroying every artifact to avoid them falling into the wrong hands, and thus to have any potential effect on humanity, potentially even destroying it. This task, which does align with the version of Aletheia depicted in Odyssey, that is the rebel Isu that wants to help humans instead of using them, actually does provide another reference to the modern day ending in Odyssey. In fact, what seemed to be a comment out of the blue with no real reason behind it, where Kassandra told Layla to destroy all the pieces of Eden, which she didn't do obviously, otherwise the franchise would end, that comment actually came from the task that Aletheia herself had entrusted Kassandra with, back in ancient Greece, and which, as we'll see, Kassandra eventually accepted, dedicated her entire life to do it. So that's another explanation provided by the crossover, but at this point Kassandra hadn't accepted the task yet. On the contrary, Cass faced the choice of leaving everyone she knew behind, traveling the world to fight these artifacts that she mainly knew for turning normal people into monsters because of the Olympus project, and this does show a very interesting scene where Kassandra tries to rebel to the task, saying that she doesn't have a say in this, or that she is too exhausted by the life she has already chosen, which causes her to decide to refuse such prospect. Of course, Kassandra's mind changed when this affected her directly and the people she loved. In fact, Barnabas took to actually find the apple where it landed on Corfu Island, and thus, after seeing what it did to the captain, she said to stop her friend before it was too late. She eventually tracked him down at the temple of Zeus in the town of Cassiope, and he was already being corrupted by the apple, but when Kassandra tried to convince him to hand over the artifact, he of course refused, symbolically moving in and out of the light as he was battling the corruption, and started fighting her. In the fight, Barnabas created a barrier around himself and also created illusionary copies of himself, which is one of the most famous uses for the apple, and because of this and the temple environment, this does look a lot like Bayek's fight with Flavius from Assassin's Creed Origins. Eventually, corrupted by the apple, Barnabas created more illusions aimed at causing pity in Kassandra and weakening her, but she destroyed them too, and eventually was able to claim back the apple, which released an energy shock that didn't kill Barnabas, but heavily bruised his right arm, and when he came to his senses, while Kassandra vented on him for being irresponsible, she also revealed to him that she was immortal, which he bought, no questions asked, but that's also in line with his personality of being very religious and believing every rumor about gods and godly behaviors. So after another surprisingly serious scene where Kassandra is actually facing how she will survive everyone that she has grown to know and love, and in the face of another situation where an artifact could have killed several people including her friends, Kassandra received another message from Aletheia that doubled down on the situation, calling her a protector of men and an intermediary between the Isu and the human worlds, and pretty much asking her again to go on and hunt more artifacts, traveling the world to destroy or depower them, and bringing peace amidst revolution and rebellion, and that is likely where she accepted the task. Eventually, Kassandra rejoined Barnabas and Herodotus in the closing moments of the quest, and while Kassandra decided not to tell Herodotus as well about her secret immortal life, she did tell both of them that she would have embarked on a mission that would have brought her far from the Greek islands. In this sequence, Kassandra finally accepts her responsibilities as keeper of the stuff, and also the new task entrusted to her by Aletheia, which, spoiler alert, she won't be able to complete even in 2,400 years. As for Herodotus, Kassandra asked him one of his writings so that he could get to be known outside the Greek world, which we'll talk about later in the video, and in exchange she gave him the Spear of Leonidas, now powerless, and that is really important because this is another reference to Odyssey's main game and goes on to fill another gap connected to it. In fact, at the start of the game, Layla finds the spear next to a book by Herodotus called The Lost Histories, which in lore was a book by Herodotus that was lost to time and that detailed his time spent with Kassandra and was later used by the Animus along with the DNA found on the spear to create the Animus simulations that we see in the game. So this moment in the crossover not only explains why the spear that Layla found was powerless, but also why it was close to a book written by Herodotus after Kassandra left for good in the wake of the Corfu events, which he even teases in a dialogue of the crossover, stating that Kassandra would be everywhere in his writings. As for Barnabas, instead, Kassandra chose him to be his second-in-command in her travels across the world, which kind of makes sense as she already told him she was immortal, so having someone she could trust could help her in her voyage, but also this could lead to some sad moments, as she likely saw Barnabas die because of his old age or during one of her hunts for the artifacts. And finally, the kicker at the end of the quest, that is at least before the post-credit scene, is that Kassandra's first destination is Egypt, and she's going to go there because she needs a new weapon to replace her spear, which is very likely a direct link to how she got her hidden blade that she's still wearing in the Valhalla portion of the crossover. This mention of Egypt, though, nicely leads into a Marvel-like post-credit scene to the quest that seems to open up the story to some potential future events. The scene takes place in Alexandria, Egypt, within the famous library, at an unspecified time, but with the Origins soundtrack rolling in the background. Here we see a hooded figure that reveals herself to be Kassandra, who has finally traveled to Egypt and is putting a parchment amidst the other ones located in the library, finally fulfilling the promise she made to Herodotus and having his writings known to the whole world, as the parchment itself shows the name Herodotus written in Greek over it. The interesting element here, as pointed out by Viral Undead on Twitter, is that within the library of Alexandria in Origins you can indeed find a document that does mention Herodotus and his histories book, which may or may not be an icing on the cake that the post-credits scene was hinting at, but even more important is another detail that was pointed out to us by Heather Counts and just a user on Twitter. In fact, in this brief scene, our hooded Kassandra is actually using the bracer of the hidden blade that she is seen using in the Valhalla portion of the DLC. Not the full blade, only the bracer featuring the Gorgon on one side, and on the other side the eagle feasting on a snake that was also featured on the sails of the Aletheia. Now, it's not clear when this is taking place, but it does hint that at this point in Egypt, Kassandra either had this bracer created because she liked it, or more likely she had already interacted with the Hidden Ones, which in itself bears another question: when is this taking place? When did Kassandra go to Egypt? If Egypt was about to be her first destination, it means that she traveled there with Barnabas in the early 410s BCE, meaning that she got there way earlier than when the Hidden Ones were established, which was in 47 BCE, that is 3 centuries later. That would explain why she's not wearing a hidden blade in this post-credit scene, and in this case it would mean that she may be on the hunt for the Apple of Eden shown in Origins, but some centuries before that. Instead, if what we're seeing in the post-credit scene is actually taking place in Bayek's and Aya's time, this might explain how Kassandra got to know about the Hidden Ones and later obtained the Hidden Blade, but this wouldn't explain why Herodotus' writings would be known in Egypt already before Kassandra got there to bring them. But most importantly, the biggest question here is this truly a Marvel-like post-credit scene hinting at some more story coming up? Is this a hint to an Origins crossover? The recently hinted and pretty much announced 60 FPS patch for Origins does seem to lead to such a conclusion, but if that's really the case, what would it be about? Again, if this is actually happening right after the events of this crossover, in the next crossover Kassandra may reach Egypt's shores in the late 5th century BCE to bring Herodotus' writings, and that might actually lead her to meet Darius and her now grown-up son Elpidios, who were indeed based in Egypt at the time. Otherwise, if this is going to more likely lead to a more mainstream but also more meaningful crossover, we could have Kassandra go to Egypt in Bayek's and Aya's time, maybe after the events of Origins when the Hidden Ones are established, and that would explain directly how she got to meet the Hidden Ones and got her Hidden Blade, while she would also meet her own descendant Aya, which would make for a very interesting and heartfelt moment. And that was it for the analysis of the Odyssey portion of the crossover content. What do you guys think of our interpretation of the events? Do you agree or disagree with them? And where do you see Kassandra's story go moving forward? Let us know in the comments below. Also, keep your eyes on the channel in the coming days as we'll be analyzing the Valhalla portion of the crossover, with a meetup between Eivor and Kassandra, the hunt for a new artifact, some more heartfelt moments, and well, some silly stuff too. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.